Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I thought today might be a good opportunity to come on here and talk about the menstrual cycle. I thought that'd be a good place to start. I wanted to come on and chat about how the menstrual cycle actually works and change maybe what you know about the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. Also the cycle length and how that varies. Also discuss what an average menstrual cycle is and potential abnormalities or things that are abnormal that mean that you should probably speak to a healthcare provider. So those are things that I'm going to talk about. A lot of people think that the menstrual cycle describes their period and what's happening at their period. And look, that's, I guess, what we're taught. When we get taught at sex education, we get told about, you'll experience a period. And I guess that's something that's a physical thing that you'll see. So I guess that's why they probably start with it, because as a young girl, that's something that you're probably going to have to come to learn to get used to, and I understand that, but I guess the menstrual cycle is so much more complex than just having a period. But maybe that's where society now sort of focuses so much on our periods. Whenever everyone says, oh, how long your cycles, a lot of people think that just means how long you bleed for. But really, your menstrual cycle starts the first day of your period and ends the day before your next period. That's the length of your menstrual cycle. So menstrual cycle doesn't mean period, it means the whole cycle and what is happening during then. And it is a complex communication pathway between your brain and your ovaries. Is one of the things why I find the female body so amazing is that there's these feedback mechanisms. So, it's sort of constantly feeding back to the brain and telling it what to do, which is just quite incredible. So it can sort of increase or decrease the levels of those hormones depending on what is happening and where you are in your menstrual cycle, which is quite fascinating, quite amazing. But basically, your menstrual cycle, the reason we have them, the whole purpose of our is to enable us to reproduce. Whether you want that to occur or not, our body is trying to do that each and every month, which is quite wild to think that it wants us to get pregnant all the time. And you might not want that. But again, this also comes back to that narrative that I'm trying to change. It doesn't matter where you are trying to get pregnant or not. Knowing that you're ovulating, knowing that you're fertile, and having your menstrual cycle is so important for your overall health. And the hormones that are present are so beneficial for your whole body. To give you an idea, estrogen is one of the main hormones that is produced during your menstrual cycle. And it helps strengthen bones. It's a mood regulator. It's for a healthy heart and cardiovascular system. It improves insulin sensitivity, it supports your libido and sleep. It helps with so many factors that impact your body. So that's why it's really important that you experience estrogen, for instance. And when we do go through the menopause and our estrogen levels are quite low and we're not having those huge spikes because we're not ovulating during that time, you can see issues with low estrogen. So a lot of people after the menopause might get osteoporosis because we're losing that estrogen that's helping strengthen our bones. Little things like that. It plays a big role in that. But then on the other hand, ovulating, you only experience progesterone in the second half of your menstrual cycle. And again, progesterone is so beneficial for our whole body, not just for our reproductive system. So it is an anti-anxiety and antidepressant. It helps reduce male hormones in our body, androgens. It boosts energy, it improves sleep, it's a natural diuretic, it's an anti-inflammatory, it's so beneficial, again, for our whole body. It also helps with bone health and things too. So again, if you don't experience ovulation and experience both these different phases and these 2 hormones, it can impact your body and overall health. So hence why it's really important. The menstrual cycle can be broken up into 2 different phases. You've got pre-ovulation, so before an egg is released, and you've got post-ovulation, which is after an egg is released. It's important to understand that the menstrual cycle involves the ovaries and the uterus going through different phases. I guess how I like to look at the menstrual cycle, you get taught that it's 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. But really, it's more complex than that. I guess they do that because it's an easy way to sort of explain what's happening. But yeah, it's so much more complex. The ovaries and the uterus go through different phases. So the start of your period is the start of the ovarian phase, called the follicular phase. That first half of your menstrual cycle is those follicles growing and developing. So I guess the name sort of speaks for itself. Follicular phase, follicles are growing. Those eggs are inside those fluid-filled sacs in your ovaries, and they are starting to get bigger and bigger. And as they get bigger, they release more and more estrogen. And that's what triggers back to the brain to then increase the luteinizing hormone, which triggers ovulation and triggers that release of the egg from that follicle. Ovulation is the next phase of the ovarian cycle. Once you have that surge in luteinizing hormone, you generally then would ovulate around 36 hours after that. Then the egg will only survive for 12 to 24 hours after that. So it is only sort of that short period. And then after that, you have the post-ovulation, that after the egg is released, which is called the luteal phase. And that on the ovary is when the egg, or the follicle that has released an egg, forms what's called a corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum is still under control of the luteinizing hormone, so it's still having its effect because that's what helps to produce progesterone. That corpus luteum, it's basically like a temporary endocrine gland. And that's what produces progesterone to help support that lining of the uterus. But you can see so many things happening, so many communication pathways happening. Progesterone also helps the brain, tell the brain to keep the other hormones low because you've released an egg. It wants to see what happens to this egg. It doesn't want you getting pregnant again. So it doesn't want to release any more eggs. So it's really important that it tells the brain that. And that's what then these feedback loops, it keeps those hormone levels low. So then you can't release any more eggs, just that one. It wants to see what happens to that one egg. Of course, sometimes you can release multiple eggs. That can happen. It usually happens within 24 hours of the first egg being released. But of course, there are anomalies, but generally that's what happens. The uterus, on the other hand, goes through 3 phases as well. So, of course, the first one is your period. It is the lining of the uterus coming away. That is the first part. Then it goes into what's called the proliferative phase, where it's building back up all that lining that was lost during your period. And this is all happening at the same time as the ovaries are going through the follicular phase. It is that estrogen that's being produced that acts on the lining of the uterus to help rebuild it again. So it needs that estrogen to help rebuild that lining that was lost. Then once ovulation has occurred, it goes into the secretory phase. So it's sort of in line with the luteal phase. But that progesterone that's being produced, like I said, then helps support the lining, make it the perfect environment for that embryo that it's hoping that is there to establish and a pregnancy to occur. So you can see it's a very complex communication pathway, but the ovaries and the uterus go through different things. And I think that's what I wanted to establish. That's why I don't like the 4 phases, because it's not period, follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase. The period is happening at the same time as the follicular phase. And so on and so forth. So you can see that there's different things that are happening, but also important for the reproductive system. The other thing that I like to say, it's like there's so many things working together all at the same time. They say women are good multitaskers. Our body is always multitasking. These communication pathways, it's always doing these 2 different things at once. And every day is different because it just depends on where you are in your menstrual cycle and sort of what the hormones and the communication is happening. So yeah, I guess you could say we're multitasking queens. Our bodies are doing it all every day and always. But I guess on that, there is so much, there's so many things that can sort of interrupt this pathway. It is a very sensitive pathway. And the other thing that I wanted to sort of talk about, especially on this little video, is that the menstrual cycle, we get taught, or whenever you see images of the menstrual cycle, they always say it's 28 days, and that ovulation always occurs on day 14, and then your period will happen 14 days later. But we're not clockwork. We're not always going to be that. And I guess they use that as what is a typical cycle. But I can tell you right now that from a lot of studies that I have looked into, that's not the average. It's quite varied. Personal reel, so you can see some little fun facts about this. Did you know that ovulation doesn't always occur on day 14 like you may have been taught to believe? Whenever you see images explaining the menstrual cycle, you probably notice they are always 28 days in length, and ovulation always occurs on day 14 or 14 days before your next period. This is used as an example of what happens during the average menstrual cycle, but it's actually not even the average of when most people ovulate. One study looking at 330 women trying to conceive found that 50% thought they ovulated on day 14 because that's what they were told, but only 20% actually ovulated on day 14 to 15. The actual average was day 16 to 17. The point is, everyone is different and unique, and it's important to learn what is happening to your body, especially if you're trying to track your cycle to become pregnant or avoid pregnancy, as getting the timing right is crucial. I was even looking into another study of over 600,000 menstrual cycles were analysed for this. And it was really interesting that they were looking at how long the follicular phase is. And I think, again, that's follicular phase is really important to understand. That's the phase that is going to determine how long your menstrual cycle is, because that corpus luteum, that temporary endocrine gland that forms, can only live for a set amount of time. It is very set in that it can only survive sort of, I'm going to say 11 to 17 days, because I don't like it when it's under 10. So 11 to 17 days. And once you learn the length of your luteal phase, you will notice that it is very consistent, because that's how long that corpus luteum can survive. When you do have issues with that corpus luteum, say that it, or say once you know you're ovulated and you're having really short luteal phase, that means that you might not be producing enough progesterone, or that, you know, the growth and ovulation phase of that follicle wasn't strong enough. So there could be things that we need to look into in terms of health and lifestyle, or even, you know, some medications. You might need to talk to your doctor about being on some medications to sort of help that follicle growth, which there are, you know, lots of things that you can utilize. But it's really important that that phase is really consistent. It's the follicular phase that can vary. How long that follicle starts to grow and that egg matures, however long that takes, is going to establish the length of your menstrual cycle. So for instance, that study that I was talking about, so 600,000 cycles they analysed, and that follicular phase, the average length of that follicular phase they found was 16.9 days, so nearly 17 days. Again, not 14 days. It's not going to be 14 days before you experience ovulation. The luteal phase they determined was about 12.4. Again, not 14 days, then you experience your period. So I think it's really important to know that everyone is different. Your body is different. Your body is unique. Every month is going to be different. So it's really important to understand that. And when you understand what's happening in your menstrual cycle, you'll learn how long each phase generally is. Probably a good time to plug that I can help with that. That is something you were interested in learning, so you can establish what phase of the menstrual cycle you are in and determine the proper length of each phase. I can help with that. So that's something you're interested in. Go to my website, www.stephanieann.com.au. Have a look at my services and I can help you learn about your body. So yeah, really important to know that this narrative that we have started, that's been around, that 28 days, or whenever you see these images, 28 days, it's not entirely accurate. It's not entirely true. So that's why I like these studies. They show that everyone is different, and there was, people with longer cycles will ovulate later, people with shorter cycles will ovulate earlier, and it's really important to establish that, so then you know what's happening. Especially if you're wanting to avoid pregnancy or trying to achieve a pregnancy, knowing when ovulation is occurring is so important. That is the main thing that you need to know, and that's when it's really critical. The timing is so critical to establish that, because you need to know whether you need to have intercourse or change your sexual behaviors to avoid getting pregnant. So it's really, really important. And then, it comes down to, everyone relies on their apps to sort of help them, but learning what your body is telling you is different to sort of what the apps are telling you. The apps are using algorithms and calculations to sort of figure out. They're using what's called the rhythm method. And the rhythm method, it doesn't tell you what's happening in your menstrual cycle right now. It doesn't tell you those things. Only you can learn to identify those signs of impending ovulation. Nothing can ever predict ovulation. Even learning to track your menstrual cycle, you establish those things in retrospect. You have to wait for the next day. So nothing will ever sort of predict ovulation. I think that's really important to establish as well. Even your luteinizing hormone or ovulation tests, they're just looking for that rising luteinizing hormone. They don't say you've ovulated. They don't say, ovulation is going to happen. They give you a guide, but sometimes they're not always appropriate for people. Like someone like me, I have a naturally high occurring luteinizing hormone. So if I was to do those tests throughout my menstrual cycle, I would get lots of positives. And that would make it very confusing, because it's like, when do I time sex? But when you know that, when you learn to sort of listen to your body and the natural cues, you can then learn to make sure you are timing sex correctly during those times, especially if you're wanting to get pregnant, of course.